The winter of 1987 came with a cruelty that no almanac could predict. Margaret stood at the window of their cramped apartment, watching her mother's breath form fog against the glass pane, each exhale a visible reminder of how little warmth their world contained anymore. Outside, the factory smokestacks that had once provided their livelihood now stood dark and silent, like monuments to a dead industry. Her father had passed 3 years ago, a slow goodbye measured in medical bills and lost wages. Now, at 23 years old, Margaret was the only thing standing between her mother and complete destitution. The bills had grown teeth. The landlord's visits had become more aggressive, his threats more concrete. She worked double shifts at the diner, her feet aching by midnight, her mind consumed by arithmetic that never balanced. $40 short for rent, $70 short for her mother's medication, $100 short for their survival. She had tried everything within her reach. She had pawned her grandmother's jewelry, the one thing that held any real value, and that had bought them 3 weeks of reprieve. She had taken on extra jobs, cleaning homes for wealthy families in the valley, mending clothes until her fingers bled, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees while society's excess glittered around her. Nothing was ever enough. The world had a way of keeping people like her down, of ensuring that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you sacrificed, there was always another mountain to climb, another debt to pay. Her mother, Dorothy, was unraveling. Once a vibrant woman who sang while she worked, she had become a shadow of herself. The arthritis had stolen her mobility, and with it, her dignity. She couldn't work anymore. She could barely dress herself without wincing in pain. Margaret had become everything: nurse, breadwinner, daughter, ghost. She existed in a fog of exhaustion, where days blended into nights, and her own dreams had become luxuries she could no longer afford to indulge. But that evening, when the knock came at their door, Margaret would later understand that desperation was the perfect soil for terrible decisions. The man at the door was a stranger, tall, weathered, his face creased like old leather left out in the sun. He wore expensive clothes that seemed out of place in their neighborhood. Behind him stood another man, younger, with calculating eyes. The stranger introduced himself as Elliot Crane, and he spoke about her mother. Word traveled in their neighborhood, and Margaret's sacrifices had not gone unnoticed. He had heard about a dutiful daughter, about a woman drowning in medical debt, about a situation that could be solved. When he mentioned the amount, $5,000, Margaret felt her knees weaken. That was a fortune. That was an ocean of relief. That was a lifetime of breathing room. But then came the condition. "My son needs a wife," Elliot Crane had said, his voice level, matter of fact, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "He's 47, difficult, not interested in refinement or propriety, but strong, rich, capable of providing for your mother in ways you never could." Margaret's throat had tightened. She had heard the stories about Crane's son, Nathaniel. Everyone in the valley had. He owned thousands of acres of mountain land, timber operations that stretched across 3 counties. He was a man who had never wanted for anything and consequently appreciated nothing. He had gone through wives before, 3, maybe 4, depending on who you believed. There were whispers about why they left. There were darker whispers about why some didn't. But those were just stories, weren't they? Gossip, the kind of thing poor people told to feel less insignificant about their circumstances. "I can't," Margaret had whispered, and she meant it. She would rather starve. She would rather her mother suffer. She would rather any fate than marriage to a man like that. But Elliot had smiled, and in that smile was the entire weight of the world's indifference to her suffering. He had left his card on their table, $300 in cash beside it. "Think about it," he said. "The money is nothing to me. Consider it a gift, a gesture of good faith. If you change your mind, call me within the week. After that, I'll find someone else, but your mother won't see another winter without help." He had walked out, leaving her standing there, the bills scattered on the table before her, her mother coughing in the other room, and $300 more than she'd ever had in her life. The weight of choice had settled on her shoulders like a physical thing, crushing her beneath its burden. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table and did the mathematics of despair. Her mother's insulin cost $40 a month. Their apartment cost $300. Food, utilities, the endless stream of small necessities that were killing them slowly. Everything added up to a life of impossible choices. Elliot had taken the most impossible choice of all and made it seem simple. Just one sacrifice, he had implied. One person's life for another's salvation. People did this, she knew. She had read stories about arranged marriages in her school books. This was just modern America's version of the same ancient trade. It had been done for centuries. Survival was survival. Love was a luxury. By the third day, Margaret found herself dialing the number on the card. By the fourth day, she was signing papers in a lawyer's office. By the fifth day, Elliot had paid the $5,000 directly to her landlord and to the hospital. The weight lifted from her mother's shoulders, and in its place came a different kind of weight: shame, guilt, and the terrible knowledge of what she had done. But her mother was alive. Her mother would stay alive. And that, Margaret told herself, was worth everything. The drive to Nathaniel Crane's estate took 3 hours, climbing higher and higher into the mountains until civilization fell away behind them and the world became nothing but stone, sky, and endless forest. Margaret sat in the back of the car that Elliot had sent for her, her small suitcase beside her, her wedding dress, a simple white thing purchased from a discount store, hanging in plastic on the hook above the window. The dress swayed slightly with each curve of the mountain road, a ghost of the bride she was meant to be. She had not told her mother everything. She had simply said she was getting married, that she would be cared for, that the worst was over. The look in her mother's eyes when Margaret told her had been the most terrible thing of all, a mixture of relief and suspicion and desperate hope. Dorothy had asked few questions, and Margaret had answered fewer. Some truths were too heavy to carry in conversation. The property announcement came not with signs, but with a sudden opening in the forest. The trees parted, and there rose a massive house, not quite a mansion, but larger than any home Margaret had ever imagined. Built of stone and dark wood, it perched on the mountainside like a fortress, overlooking valleys that stretched out in layers of blue and green. There was a kind of savage beauty to it, a reminder that this land had never truly been tamed. It had only been temporarily occupied by men with ambitions too large for their own good. The driver, a silent man in his 60s, pulled up to the entrance and opened her door with mechanical courtesy. A woman appeared, older, severe-looking, in black dress and pearls. She introduced herself as Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper. "I'll show you to your rooms," she said, not meeting Margaret's eyes. "The mister expects dinner at 7. You'll be informed of the household routines in due course." The rooms were beautiful and cold. High ceilings, windows that looked out over the mountains, furniture that spoke of expensive taste. There was a bedroom with a 4-poster bed draped in heavy fabric, and an adjoining room with a marble tub and fixtures of polished gold. Margaret sat on the edge of that bed and felt the full weight of what she had done crash down on her like an avalanche. This was her life now. This fortress was her prison. The man she would meet at dinner was her keeper, and the contract she had signed meant she belonged to him in every way that the law understood belonging. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, and Margaret closed her eyes and thought of her mother. She thought of insulin and warm meals and a roof that wouldn't leak. She had made a bargain with the devil, and the devil had come to collect. Nathaniel Crane appeared at dinner like a force of nature, all broad shoulders and weathered hands, his face marked by the same cruelty that lived in his father's smile but amplified, hardened, sharpened by a lifetime of getting exactly what he wanted. He was taller than Margaret expected, and older, and his eyes held no welcome, no curiosity, no human recognition whatsoever. He looked at her the way a man might examine a piece of property he'd acquired but wasn't particularly interested in. "So you're the desperate one," he said, not bothering with hello or any other social pleasantry. He seated himself at the head of the long dining table, leaving her at the opposite end, so far away that conversation required effort, which immediately made it clear that no conversation would be happening. The meal was served by silent staff. Margaret picked at her food, acutely aware of the sound of Nathaniel eating, the scrape of his fork against china, the occasional grunt of dismissal. Halfway through the main course, he finally spoke, not to her, but as if she were a secretary recording his thoughts. "You'll understand your position here. I don't tolerate gossip, complaint, or any form of weakness. You'll attend functions when I require it, dressed appropriately, and you'll smile and play your role. You'll manage the household finances within the budget I provide. Generous, but not unlimited. You'll keep yourself presentable." He paused to take a long drink of wine. "And you'll produce an heir within 2 years. If you don't, you'll be sent back, and your mother's financial support will cease. Your father's condition will determine whether you're sent with dignity or without." The words landed like stones in still water, each one creating ripples of horror. Margaret felt her voice crumble before she could force it out. "What if I can't?" "Can't or won't," he interrupted, his voice cutting. "Those are two different things. Can't suggests a medical issue that we'll address with the best doctors money can buy. Won't suggest a deficiency of character, and I don't tolerate deficiencies in my wife any more than I tolerate them in my cattle." He stood, threw his napkin onto his plate with deliberate carelessness. "Your things will be moved to my bedroom tonight. We'll proceed with our arrangement immediately. I trust you understand that you're here to serve a function, and sentiment is not part of that function." He left the table, and Margaret sat alone in that enormous room, surrounded by her untouched food and the terrible clarity that she had made a mistake. But she could not undo it. She could not call her mother and tell her the truth. She could not walk away. She was trapped in a golden cage on a mountain, and the door had locked behind her. That night, she learned what her mother's survival had cost her in ways that went beyond financial debt. Nathaniel approached physical intimacy with the same careless domination he brought to everything else, and Margaret endured it with her jaw clenched and her eyes closed and a part of her consciousness separate, hovering above her body, refusing to be present for what was happening. When it was over, he rolled away without a word and fell asleep instantly, leaving her staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside her harden into a cold, impenetrable substance. The price of $40, she thought, had been the price of something else. It had been the price of herself. Days became weeks, and Margaret began to understand the structure of her prison. She was expected to manage a household of 15 staff members. She was expected to host dinner parties for wealthy families from surrounding counties. She was expected to play the role of Mrs. Crane with grace and poise, while internally dying from the cold distance of her husband's indifference. He didn't hate her. That might have been easier. Hate implies passion, and Nathaniel was entirely unmoved by her presence. She was furniture that occasionally had a function. He had legitimate business interests that occupied most of his time: timber operations, land investments, political connections with powerful men who looked at the world the same way he did. Margaret became invisible in her own marriage, which was both a blessing and a curse. 3 months into the marriage, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The confirmation came at the private office of Dr. Haswell, the elderly physician who served the wealthy families of the valley. He handed her the test results with the same professional smile he had perfected over 50 years of delivering news that was never purely simple. "Congratulations, Mrs. Crane," he said. "You're approximately 6 weeks along, perfectly healthy, perfectly normal." Margaret felt no joy, no maternal instinct, no sense of future hope. She felt the weight of Nathaniel's expectations settling down on her like a stone. She had fulfilled her function quickly. The heir was coming. This meant her value had increased, at least temporarily. It also meant the truly difficult part was beginning. She returned to the house expecting to announce the news to Nathaniel, thinking perhaps it might change something, soften something in his rigid worldview. She was naive in that hope. When she told him that evening, he simply nodded, made a note in his calendar, and returned to reading his newspaper. "Good," he said. 2 years is the acceptable time frame for these things. Ensure you have proper medical care. I don't need complications." The pregnancy was isolating. As her body changed, as she became increasingly aware of the life growing within her, Margaret found herself deeper in depression. This child would bind her to Nathaniel forever. This child would be raised in this house, taught by Nathaniel's values, molded into a version of herself or him that perpetuated the cycle of cold pragmatism and emotional starvation. She began to understand the wives who had come before her, the whispers about where they had gone, why they had left. Some of them probably hadn't left at all. Some of them probably were still here, buried in the mountain soil, their cries absorbed by the endless wind. Around month 4, Margaret's mother called. Dorothy sounded weak on the phone, and Margaret's blood ran cold. "Nothing to worry about, darling," her mother said, but there was falseness in her voice, the same falseness Margaret used to hide her own despair. "Just a spell. The doctor says I'm fine, just tired." But something in Margaret knew it was a lie. She made an excuse to visit, drove down the mountain despite Nathaniel's displeasure, and found her mother in her apartment looking like a hollow version of herself. The arthritis had progressed to her heart. The stress, the doctors said, had aged her in ways that medicine couldn't measure. Dorothy clutched her daughter's hand and wept, begging for details about Margaret's life, about whether she was happy, whether the terrible price had been worth it. Margaret couldn't tell her the truth. Instead, she lied and smiled and promised that everything would be fine, that once the baby came, everything would make sense. When she returned to the mountain, Nathaniel was waiting. "You're too distracted," he said coldly. "Your mother's problems are not my concern. Your value to me is in producing a perfect heir, and a distracted mother produces inferior offspring. Your visits stop, effective immediately." She tried to argue. She had never tried to argue before, had learned quickly that argument was a form of insubordination that Nathaniel crushed without mercy. But desperation gave her courage that she didn't know she possessed. She's dying, Margaret said, her voice shaking. I need to see her. You need to remember why you're here, he interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that made the servants disappear from the room in fear. Your mother is alive because of my generosity. She lives in comfort because I allow it. She breathes because I've decided her life has value. The moment you become inconvenient, the moment you fail to remember your place, that arrangement ends. Do you understand? Margaret understood. She understood perfectly. In that moment, something inside her shifted.